And the definition, if I remember right, of Sirencide is this feeling of invincibility that you get whenever responding with lights and sirens on that leads to increased risk taking.
Stay tuned. Coming up, it's my interview with Dusty Lambert, a firefighter who completed his doctoral dissertation while researching Sirencide, the impact of acute stress on emergency vehicle crashes. Hello and welcome to the Situational Awareness Matters Show, episode 388. I'm your host, Rich Gassaway. The purpose of this show is to improve situational awareness and decision-making for individuals and teams who work in high-risk, high-consequence, time-compressed environments with changing conditions. The SA Matters mission is simple. We want to help you see the bad things coming and time to prevent bad outcomes. Today's feature segment is sponsored by Gassaway Virtual Training. There are 33 online training programs there for you to choose from. Some of the programs are live events presented virtually, and some of them are pre-recorded programs. To learn more, visit the samatters.com website and click on the Virtual Training tab. Okay, let's jump into our feature segment, my interview with Dr. Dusty Lambert, as we talk about his research on Sirencide, the impact of acute stress in emergency vehicle crashes. Hey everyone, Rich Gassaway here, host of the Situational Awareness Matters Show, and on today's episode we have Dusty Lambert, a gentleman that I got acquainted to when he reached out to me. He was doing his PhD research, and I got a chance to look through his research, and really intrigued me. And I told him when he was all done, I wanted to have him on the show to share his findings. It's a very fascinating study, and one that I think the fire services at Fire and EMS are really going to benefit from. So, Dusty, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Rich. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, really glad, really excited to have this conversation. Let's start with your background. So tell us, where you've been and where you are and what you do.
Sure. Grew up, born and raised north central West Virginia, a little town called Jane Lou. When I was in high school, joined the local volunteer fire department as a junior fireman. Then graduated high school, started college at Fairmont State University, which used to be college, and I believe you have some familiarity with that school, right? So started there, realized that you can make a career out of being a firefighter, tested for the City of Fairmont Fire Department and got hired at 19. So I've been there for 18 and a half years, almost coming up on 19 years. Finished up my education at Fairmont State in occupational safety and health, and had that moment after graduation of, well, now what, even though I was gainfully employed, and applied for grad school, went to West Virginia University for my master's of safety management, and then had the same now what moment and continued on to finish up my doctorate just in December in emergency management. So I'm currently a lieutenant in the fire service, still love my job, and have tried to marry my two passions of my education and safety and my career.
And where are you serving as a lieutenant at?
That's for the City of Fairmont Fire Department, so north central West Virginia.
Okay.
Yep.
And how long have you been on the fire department?
18 and a half-ish years, so almost 19. Yeah, I started young.
You don't look old enough to have that kind of service time in.
Thank you. I was fortunate to get hired young, so still not sure what I'm going to be when I grow up, but I like my job now, so I might just stay there. You're probably not sure either, right?
Well, it does raise an interesting question, because when I talk with folks who are pursuing PhDs, I often ask them, what's the end goal? What are you gonna do with this? Because you certainly don't need a PhD to be in the fire service. You don't need one to be a fire chief. You don't need one for really any type of work you do for the fire service, other than maybe research or if you're doing counseling. Right. So what was the motivation to pursue this? Because it's very
demanding,
very costly. So
yeah.
What was the big why at the end as to why you're doing this?
I can't lie and say that part of it wasn't just habit. I mean, I've been a career student throughout my career, so at some point you're just like, well, I'll just keep going. But I do enjoy research. I think that I was, like I said, I was fortunate to marry my two passions: safety, occupational safety, and my career in the fire service. So, but down the road, I enjoy teaching. I would have no problem being a professor. I'm an adjunct now. I like doing research and would love to do research, perhaps with NIOSH or any of the research entities now that are sort of skewing over to examine the U.S. Fire Service in particular. So I think there's becoming more and more demand for that. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. So that's your plan B career. Like after you finish your fire service career, then you're going to go on and do that.
Yeah. That's sort of plan B, part two, I guess, not plan B.
Part due.
That's right.
So what I'm curious as to what the people in the fire department have to think or say to you or about you in this pursuit of educational endeavors, because my historical experience, even in my own department, was that there were a lot of people scratching their heads saying, what in the world and why in the world and what are you going to do with this? And there was even, some I would call fits of jealousy, even especially from among my boss, that was really bizarre and unexpected. Have you experienced anything strange like that?
I hate to jump straight to blaming that, but generally unimpressed, I would say overall, which is fair. I don't blame them. A college education improves you as a person, but it doesn't make you better than anybody else. And everybody has something that I can learn from. So I chose my journey, through the scholarly world. But it's fair. I can be as self-deprecating and call myself a nerd just like anybody else, and that's fair. So I'm okay with that.
Okay. So the what's the title of your dissertation?
So the title, of course, it changed quite a few times, but the final title was Sirencide: The Impact of Acute Stress in Emergency Vehicle Crashes. So a lot of people in the fire service will recognize the buzzword Sirencide. I think it's worked its way into our emergency vehicle operations EVOC courses. And so I wanted to kind of put that in there sort of as a nod towards that colloquial term that we use.
And what inspired this to be your research topic?
Well, a lot of things. And as you know, as you work through your research career, you have a lot of input. You probably change your mind quite a few times, but I had a lot of things that were pointing me in the direction of what my research was. So first, we know that first responders, fire, police, EMS, all experience chronic stress. And that's probably no surprise to anybody, whether they're in or out of these services. So chronic stress over the course of their career, evidenced by the number of stress-related diseases that we see and higher rates in these jobs, these professions. So we have, higher heart attacks, higher strokes, higher blood pressure, a lot of things that can be traced back to chronic stress. But that chronic stress is a culmination of many, many acute stress events. So that's the individual calls that we respond to. So that, of course, is interesting, and there's tons of research out there on that. But I wanted to look at the effects of this stress acutely in the short term. So when I started doing a little more research into this, we know, and have known this since the 70s, since some pretty pivotal research studies in the 70s and 80s, that this stress happens at the time of dispatch. So right at the time of alarm, we get these spikes in rush of adrenaline. We get spikes in heart rates, respiration rates. And what's interesting about this is it's psychogenic in nature. It's emotional. So there's no physical actions that have been correlated with it. Yes, even though we'll get a call and we'll run to the truck, or a police officer might run to the car, they've controlled for that, and it's independent. So that tells us that what we're hearing is leading to our emotional spike in our stress and our emotional states. So what was really interesting to me, and no surprise though, and everybody that I've told this to in the fire service and law enforcement, it's no surprise, but it's interesting that there was research to back it up, is that there are certain call types, certain types of incidents that are more arousing than others, more exciting. And for firefighters, there's some research that shows that fires are more exciting at the time of dispatch over false alarms. And that's an older study that indicated that. But 2009, there was a pretty pivotal study that they noticed, they weren't aiming to look at this, but they noticed that anytime that there was a dispatch to an incident that had the keyword entrapment in it, so where victims might be trapped in a car or in a house fire, that there were significant spikes in their heart rates and respirations just at the time of dispatch, no other action. And I think most people in the fire service would say, yeah, we pick up the pace a little bit. You know, we kind of get that laser focus when we hear that somebody is trapped. I know it wasn't really any surprise to me, but it was interesting. And this carries over to EMS, emergency medical services as well. Their particularly stressful incidents or anything to do with children. Again, no surprise. I've experienced this, and car crashes. So if they're responding to a car crash, they have a little bit more of an excited response psychologically. And law enforcement officers also have their two particular exciting responses, which is responses to weapons. So any type of incident where they're dispatched and somebody might have a weapon, understandable, and to back up another officer, which that was interesting to me, that there's a lot of camaraderie in the law enforcement in all these careers, but you know, that one in particular had a significant spike in their emotional response. And what's so interesting about these, at least in the fire side, is that this psychological response to just hearing the alarm is comparable to the stress that we experience at the actual scene. So if we get a heart rate spike of 150 beats per minute on average, when we hear entrapment, then we are also experiencing that 150 beats per minute, that same spike at the actual incident when we have to go do our jobs. So it's not to be taken lightly. That sort of explains the amount of stress that we're under in the course of our career. So that led me to question, how does this affect us acutely? So if we're getting excited over certain type of calls over others, and we're getting that excited, how is that affecting us in the short term? So, you know, as a researcher, you have to come up with a way to measure it. So you can't just make accusations. You got to come up with a way to scientifically prove what you're examining. So we know that stress makes us stupid, right? We know that it affects our decision making, of course, situation awareness, cognition. So when we get to a certain point, it can really be a deficiency for our ability to think. And a lot of people might know the stress response curve, the Yerkes-Dodson curve, really old table that shows that the higher our levels of stress are, the poorer the outcomes, depending on what type of task we're doing, we can have. So I wanted to measure, you know, how this spike of stress for certain call types is going to affect us as first responders. And something that we all three share, and I say we, the fire service, law enforcement, and emergency medical services, that we all share, is emergency vehicle driving. So really unique professions, and that we have to deliver our services hastily to the caller's doorstep, no matter where that is. You know, as fast as some food delivery services might be, they're not really comparable to that type of response. So what I decided to do was measure the number of crashes based on the type of incident that an emergency vehicle was responding to. Of course, emergency vehicle crashes are a huge problem, right? For all three branches of emergency services. It's regularly the leading cause of traumatic death for firefighters. Regularly the leading cause of traumatic death for law enforcement officers. I think there was only 1 year in the past 10 that it surpassed, or that it didn't surpass, violent crimes. So and emergency medical services also, of course, experience the huge impact of crashes for injuries among EMT and paramedics, and among or examining the financial side. There's huge financial impacts and liability. And as a matter of fact, it's the leading cause of liability claims for all three of these. So it seemed like a good fit to use this as my measuring tool. There was a problem with emergency vehicle crashes, and it seemed like a good measure for the type of response, the stress response that I was looking at. So
did you do anything to measure the stress responses of responders as part of your research? And it might be beyond the scope of your research, but like, did you put any kind of monitoring equipment on responders as they were prepping for calls to see what their actual physiological changes were as a result of call types?
I did not. However, that would be the ideal pair to my research. So if there's any researchers out there that would like to pick up and build onto this would be the that would be the next phase, is to see if there's a correlation between my findings and the actual heart rate response, because it's hit and miss. And the way that I sorted up my incidents, you would have to have a research study that would also sort their incident types the same as what I did. So if I ever get in a position as a professional researcher, that would be a definite thing I would like to look into. So to see if there is a correlation between those.
And when you did your research, were you looking, although you mentioned police, fire, and EMS, did you do your research predominantly in one of those lanes, or did you look at all three lanes?
Yeah, so I started out hoping that I could get maybe all three, maybe two. And what was required, so I had to find some data out there. I could, of course, gather my own data, but for the sake of time, I wanted to build on maybe some data that was already out there, because these professions, especially fire and law enforcement, we're fortunate to where we have federal level entities who regularly gather data on law enforcement fatalities, line of duty deaths for firefighters. We've got the National Fallen Firefighters program that really focuses on this, U.S. Fire Administration. So NIOSH, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, we've got a lot of entities out there to gather this data. So I started looking at the data that was already out there. Law enforcement officers was close to being included, but there wasn't quite enough information on what the officer was responding to. And then some information was lacking on exposures, which I'll talk about exposures here in a second. Emergency medical services had even less data available. So that left the fire service, which was fine. So the fire service, fortunately, has very good record keeping when it comes to this. So there is information on every line of duty death maintained by the U.S. Fire Administration over the past 30 years. So I selected 20 years of data on fatalities with the U.S. Fire Service. So 2000 or 2019 is what my timetable. So it was a 20-year period that I selected. So I had the narratives for over 2,000 firefighter line of duty fatalities that I had to review. So out of all these fatalities, I was able to read these paragraph or so narratives and pull out the ones who died in the course of a crash while either en route or returning to an incident. So we excluded if it was just driving to a training scenario, or driving to or from work, but not related to an incident. So we pulled out just those fatalities for that 20-year period, which narrowed it down to 156 crashes that led to a firefighter fatality while responding or returning. And that killed 163 firefighters. So I use the term case, and that is a crash case for these counts. So what I found initially, go ahead.
Let me ask you a question. If your research is on Sirencide and the effects of acute stress, which you've made the frame that it's triggered by the type of call, why would you include the ones where they're returning? My presumption, might be wrong, that the stress level wouldn't be up, and you wouldn't have those consequences of stress physiologically or psychologically on a crew that's returning. Is that accurate or not accurate?
That is a very, very good question. And so the research does show that there are lingering effects for hours sometimes after these incidents. Now, we might not notice it. Your heart rate may have came back down some, but there are some studies that show that it can go on for hours. So to apply this to the real world, if a firefighter goes up to a call at 2 a.m. and it was particularly exciting, or traumatic, they may notice that they have difficulty falling back asleep when they do get back to station, more so than what they may perceive as a routine call. So really good question. It was a bit of an exploratory thing, but it also gives us a control. So the fire service is excellent for this because we know that they're going from their home, if they're a volunteer, to the station, and from the station to the call. And then that return trip is the exact same distance. So we could say that exposure going to the call is the exact same as the exposure returning from the call. So it was a bit of an exploratory, while I'm there, I might as well code these two just to see if it correlated with previous research too on increased crashes during response too. So yeah, that was a really good question.
Was the data skewed in one direction or the other toward the number of accidents or fatalities that were related to responding to versus returning from?
Very much so. And that there had been previous research that had supported this, although it wasn't measured in the same exact way. So again, all mine are fatal crashes. So in order for it to be included, it had to have killed at least one firefighter as a result of the crash. Which, by the way, this is particularly scary because some other previous research shows that on average, the U.S. Fire Service kills 10 civilians for every one line of duty firefighter fatality.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, that was sobering for me when I read that statistic. It makes sense. Look at the size of our trucks. The lug nut rule, the more lug nuts, that's the vehicle that's going to win. So a lot of it can be traced back to simply the size of our trucks, but they're more fatal for the people that we're sworn to protect. So that should be a eye-opening, sobering statistic for anybody listening in the emergency services. So back to your question, there was a significant difference. So out of the 156 cases, 144 were during response, and only 12 were during the returning phase. So about 12 times more likely to be involved in a fatal crash. There we go. Got some statistics to throw up on the screen there. So about 12 times more likely to be involved in a fatal crash during response than during the returning phase. And again, the exposure is the exact same, the same distance, we assume, on average between the points. So that is significant and supports previous research that this is a problem. Yeah.
And in the research that you did of those, of the 144 that were during response, were you able to glean or assess whether the accident causation was a civilian at fault or the fire the driver of the fire apparatus at fault,
Also, great.
Or did it matter in your research?
Right. There were a few that you could say that they were acts of God, I think is the term. If you're just driving down the road and a tree happens to fall in your car, you could argue that there isn't much that you can do to prevent that from happening, right? You would just say maybe that's just your time. But I didn't exclude anything based on determining a causation or a fault, because fundamentally, we assume that all accidents, all crashes are preventable. And if we assume that, which may sound far-fetched, but if you start looking at the reasons that lead up to the fatality, it's not always a simple one cause factor. So there was, for example, one who was rear-ended by a sheriff's deputy responding to the same call, and it led to the fatality of a firefighter. Now that anybody looking at it would say, it was the deputy's fault, rear-ended him from behind, but he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. So did he typically wear a seatbelt? Would that have saved his life? We get in a hurry to get to a call. Don't put your seatbelt on, because, more things are more important. And so you can't really pick and choose. There's always an array of factors that lead to that. But for the most part, these were single vehicle accidents. So there really wasn't anybody else to blame for a lot of them.
Did you or were you able to capture, or did it have any bearing on the research you did? Because it might go actually down a different trail here as to whether the responders that died were seat belted or not.
Many of them do have that listed. And especially if you pull up the NIOSH reports, because they're in a lot more detail, although they're not for each fatality. The trend seems to be that seatbelt use is improving, and that's good. And that'll support some of my auxiliary findings I'll talk about here in a minute. But I started to code that for each one, and then I decided not to, because many of them were lacking that information. Now, I hate to make assumptions, but I'm friends with a lot of police officers who would fill out reports, and it would be easy to not want to point out that I wasn't wearing my seatbelt if I was killed in a crash, because we all know that insurance companies might look at that. I would hope that we're all on the same team, and nobody wants to see somebody's family not get life insurance because they didn't have their seatbelt on. So I could reasonably see that being left out somewhat intentionally, just forgetting to put it down or saying it was unknown on some of these. And a lot of them, I'm sure, were legitimately just unknown, but it was kind of surprising how many it were listed as being unknown whether the seatbelt was being used or not.
Okay. And then was it anything that you looked at in your research about speed being a factor?
Yeah, and many have speed listed as a factor. And actually, there was some research prior to mine, just in the past couple of years, that looked at the actual causes of emergency vehicle crashes. And the overwhelming majority are human factors. Human factors being driving too fast, increased risk taking, not wearing seatbelts, not requiring your passengers to wear seatbelts, rushing through yellow lights or red lights, or not having due care as you approach intersections. So an array of reasons for crashes that are predominantly human factor related. So carelessness, and that correlates back to the effects that stress has on us as we're driving. There's other research that shows that these are the exact behaviors that people have while driving a vehicle under stress, under time pressures.
Yeah. And what was the methodology that you used to extract the results that you came up with?
So I mentioned that we were able to pull out these 144 cases, which some of these were multiple firefighters involved. And that was interesting. And each one of these were coded for the type of incident that they were responding to. So, and I sorted those based on the infers. We're all familiar in the fire service with our National Fire Incident Reporting System. the way that they have it set up for types of incidents. So the preliminary findings, whenever I counted these up, were the 144 fatalities. Bring this back up here. So the 144 fatal crashes, rather, were broken down like this. So 55.5% of them were while responding to fires, just any type of fire. That could be anything from a house fire to an outside wildfire or a dumpster fire, vehicle fire. So fires in general made up 55.5%. Rescue and EMS incidents made up about 30, almost 37% of the fatal cases. And the other four down at the bottom, if you're watching the video, were other types of incidents, which made up less than 6-7%. So the big two were the fires and the EMS. That made up for the majority of these crashes. So what I took from there, I used this data to build out further, because this led to two questions for me. First, how many fires are we responding to on average nationwide? And again, most people in the fire service will look at this and say 50% of our calls aren't fire. The majority are EMS related, and that's all across the country right now, and has been for the past couple decades. So I wanted to examine that factor, look at it as an exposure to these type of incidents, because this doesn't paint the whole picture. So I jumped into gathering more information from this. I had to get averages over the same 20-year period of how many calls that fire departments typically respond to for each one of these types of incidents. So an exposure rate. And the findings pretty much correlated with what a lot of people in the profession would expect, that the majority of our responses are EMS related. So
did you find the majority of the incidents the accidents that resulted in fatalities, where they were responding to EMS, or did you find it being more correlated, even though we have more EMS calls, more fatality accidents were responding to fire calls?
Right.
Am I getting ahead of your findings?
Yeah,
here?
no, that's the point is, the EMS calls, EMS related calls make up for, over this period, made up for about 60% of the total responses nationwide for fire departments reporting to infers. Fires only made up about 7.5% of the responses nationwide. So now you can start to see some of the disproportionate issue here. They're making up over half of the crashes, but our exposure to them are less than 8%. So that was disproportionate. But then there was another variable that came to mind, was if you look at how many apparatus or vehicles respond to a typical fire compared to a typical EMS type of incident, right? So of course, you're going to have more fire trucks and support vehicles responding to bigger incidents being fires. So I had to pull up more information from the infers database and look at the average number of responding apparatus for each one of these types of incidents. And I found that about 3.3 vehicles per fire call. EMS was about 1.6 vehicles per EMS type of call. So there was a significant difference there that helped put a little bit more of a skew on the findings. So that led me down a rabbit hole of an epidemiological type of formula, which I'm not an epidemiologist. Fortunately, my advisor was. So I had some really good mentorship on these formulas. So I took all that information. I took the exposures to the number of incidents that we were responding to, and I took the average number of apparatus for each one of those types of incidents, and we were able to come up with an exposure rate. And not to bore everybody with the math on it, but this is the same type of formula that we use to determine that firefighters are at increased risk for certain types of cancers. So when you ever hear that, and I don't know what the actual rate is, but if you hear that firefighters are 2.2 times more likely to encounter or experience testicular cancer or bladder cancer or whatever it is, they're using these same types of formulas. They're looking at exposures and the population to determine that rate. So I was looking to produce an exposure rate similar to those to determine what the risk is of responding to a fire versus the risk of responding to a medical incident or another type of incident. And what I found was that, skip ahead here just a little bit. Once I calculated all the exposures, we still had the 55% of crashes were to fires, but the exposures were about almost 12%. So it's still not in line with what you would expect, assuming that the risk is the same across all of these. So here's the results, my fundamental main findings. And the term is relative risk, or sometimes called a relative risk ratio. And we just use these numbers to compare risk of one activity to the risk of another activity, with all other things being controlled for. So what we found is that when responding to a fire type of incident, all fires combined, you have approximately a 9.3 times increased risk of being involved in a fatal crash compared to your risk when responding to all other types of incidents. And that was significant. Again, back to studying disease, anything over 1 throws up red flags. So when they're looking at these type of rates, they're looking at 1.5, 1.8, 2. That's a big deal. And my results are, 7s and 9s. And so my results are 9, almost 9.5% increased risk for fires. And in particular, I pulled out structure fires and split that from other types of fires. And within this, structure fires are the highest risk of being involved in a fatal crash compared to other types of incidents. And similarly, under the rescue and EMS types of incidents, I separated ones where somebody might be trapped, because I knew that was a reason for increased stress for firefighters, and just our routine, what I call routine, emergency medical calls. Might be somebody having a heart attack or trouble breathing. And what I found there was a relative crash risk ratio of 2.7 for the rescue type of incidents, but only 0.17 for EMS type of incidents. So there is a huge difference between those two types of calls. So yeah, there's big differences between our risk in each one of these.
So what are some of the other results of your research that maybe I haven't asked you the right question yet to kind of bring that out?
Yeah. So pull this back off here. So I mentioned earlier that I coded the responding and return trips, just sort of to see, while I was there, I might as well do it. It caused no extra work. But I did also code some other information. So the first one was coding, and it was easy. It was in the narratives, the type of duty status that the fatality involved. So in other words, were they part of a career department? Were they part of a volunteer department? Was it a combination? Was it a wildland firefighter? And most of these fatal crashes were comprised of 85% volunteers and about 11% career. Now, that might not be surprising, because the majority of America's fire service is volunteer, and it's around 75%, I believe, somewhere in there. So it seemed to make sense on the surface, because that's about how the duty is broken down. But then I looked a little further, and it dawned on me that, well, there's a huge portion of the U.S. population that's protected by full-time career departments. I believe it's in the 60 to 70% range of the population of the US that's protected by full-time firefighters. So that would mean to me that they are also running the majority of the calls in the country, the majority of the responses. So this was another disproportionate finding, that the majority were volunteer. And that sort of leads me to think that maybe there is a desensitization of certain types of incidents. So in other words, if you're not exposed to a house fire, but maybe once or twice a year, because maybe you're in a smaller department who doesn't run a lot of calls, I would propose that is probably more significantly arousing or exciting for them than somebody who might run a fire every few shifts or every few weeks. So that right there deems more research. I think that was just a supplemental finding, but it was interesting to me. There was a trend with the majority of these being in personal vehicles. And again, volunteer firefighters oftentimes will come from their homes or their workplaces to respond to either the station or directly to the scene. And so the majority of these were in personal vehicles. Now that was interesting because the U.S. Fire Service in the past 15 years has really focused on tanker trucks, tenders, if you're from the West Coast. So these are our fire apparatus that haul, 1,000 or 2,000 or more gallons of water. And they are dangerous apparatus. They are dangerous vehicles. That water sloshes around. They're very heavy and can be obviously deadly. But that made me question, is it really the tankers, or is it the fact that tankers are a vehicle that responds predominantly to fires? So that, I think, also could lead to for future research on what the actual cause of those fatal crashes are. Some other interesting findings is that.
Let me pause and ask you a question.
Go ahead.
Because you talked about the number of incidents. What was the percentage that were personal vehicles? I don't remember if you mentioned that.
I didn't. Let me pull it up here though. I got it right here, I think. No, just 1 second. Go pause for just a moment and I'll pull up my
I
other.
think you did say it was like disproportional to personal vehicles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, while you're looking at that,
Yep.
So the follow-up question I have, since the focus of the research is Sirencide, and I guess it's with my presumption that responders in an emergency vehicle with lights and sirens, that also then contributes to their level of stress, not just the type of call with initial dispatch, but also the hype and the anxiety that comes along with lights and sirens. And so that I don't misunderstand the actual intent of your study, were you focused on like emergency responses as like siren? I guess not, because you talked about returning from calls too. Because I was thinking about like these people in private vehicles that are going to the station. That was there any way for you to track whether like they had lights and sirens, or they were just
On
in their personal vehicle?
So a lot of them, it does mention it, but not all of the narratives. So, and you're right. I guess I can answer that in two ways. So there is a lot of research, especially in EMS, that looks at the impacts of lights and sirens on the driver as well as just any occupant of the vehicle. Just hearing a siren does increase your stress. Your heart rate goes up, your respirations go up. And that's why you see a lot of departments, progressive departments, that are implementing policies, especially for transporting patients, that you really need to weigh, is the lights and sirens worth it to save, a few seconds or a minute? So yeah, it's a synergistic effect that, you're already amped up. You go turn it on the lights and sirens in the vehicle and it amps you up even more. So it makes it even worse. It compounds it. And the definition, if I remember right, of Sirencide is this feeling of invincibility that you get whenever responding with lights and sirens on, that leads to increased risk taking. And the definition sort of parallels that of acute stress and driving under acute stress. They're very similar.
Okay. All right. You can continue on. I just wondered if there was anything in your research that talked about whether the people responding in their private vehicles were also,
Right.
influenced by lights and sirens or not.
Actual
But
siren.
I would guess that that's probably less accessible data. That's probably far less reported, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that's correct. All right. Let's see. I've got.
So
if I was really on the ball, I would have had all my data pulled up.
Oh, that's all right. I don't. Yeah, when you're doing a PhD research, there's a lot of data. So I don't
There
expect
is
you to
a lot of
on
data.
your fingertips be able to pull it up. We'll just, we can just go with that it was a substantial amount of private vehicle response. What are some of the trends that you noticed in the findings of your research, other than like career and volunteer or vehicle type? Was there other things that trended for you?
There was, and actually, I just found that result back to answer your last question. So, personally owned vehicles made up 47.5% of these crashes. Tankers were 22%, and engines 14.5%, and then there's some other support vehicles. So, almost half were made up of personal vehicles, and that led to a little bit of a weakness of the study too. And I can go ahead and mention is. There's always a potential that somebody could have left the scene in a personal vehicle and crashed going back home, and it not be included in the National Fire or U.S. Fire Administration's database. So that was a weakness that could have reared up. It's hard to speculate.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So back to what was your last question?
About trends that were, other than like career or volunteer or
Right.
the type of vehicle, was there anything else that kind of popped out at you?
Yeah, so I was curious about that too. How are these trending over time? So good news is that fatalities from these vehicle crashes are declining. It seems to be declining over this 20-year period. Let me rephrase that. Fatalities from crashes seem to be declining. And the reason I say that is because I was curious if the actual crashes are declining or if we are wearing seatbelts more and better design of fire apparatus, more safety features that's leading to increased safety or increased better outcomes of crashes. So I did compare the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's rates of emergency vehicle fire apparatus crashes to my results, and they paralleled on a slow decline. But the number of injuries reported from vehicle crashes from NFPA is not declining at the same rate as what these are. So it seems to be that the rate of crashes may not be on such a steep decline as the crashes just having better outcomes. And that's scary too, because like I mentioned before, the crashes are more fatal for civilians. So if that's the case, we may still be killing civilians at those rates and just not as many firefighters. So it's a lot of variables you have to look at. I learned.
Yeah. No, from your research, I know because I've done it. You offer up a list of recommendations. Here's what I found. Here's the problem. Here's the results. Now I have some recommendations as to maybe how the problem can be, or the results can be improved, or the problem can be reduced, or outcomes can be made different. What kind of recommendations did you offer up?
Right, absolutely. So I think first and foremost is training. I mean, just simply knowing this fact that when you roll out the door, if you hear that 4-letter F word, fire, on the radio, you have to realize that it is likely affecting you, and it is going to increase your risk of being involved in a fatal crash, and in turn, a risk of a non-fatal crash in general. So I think that, that finding right there, just getting the word out there of that increased risk might make people slow down and think to themselves, okay, let's take a breath here and calm down, focus on getting there safely first before we can, help anyone else. And then on top of that, there's a few other controls that could be implemented. Learning to control your emotions and your excitement. The military special forces use a technique called box breathing. You might be familiar with, Rich, to help calm your nerves, so to speak. It involves taking a 4-second breath, holding it for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4 seconds, and not inhaling for another 4 seconds, and then just repeating that cycle. So you can't control your heart rate or your body's ability to dump adrenaline, but you can control your breathing, and in turn control the psychological response to that excitement. But I think that also leads to maybe future research on finding ways to help control this. One of an interesting thing to me, one of the controls for this type of response is in the aviation industry. I got my private pilot certificate a few years back, and as you go through pilot training, they tell you there are external factors that may push you to fly when otherwise you shouldn't be flying, or push you to skip over certain checks or certain pivotal safety things that you need to do. So knowing that there are these external factors, and that in the aviation world, that could be a passenger who really needs to get back for a meeting. So maybe you feel rushed to get on the runway and get in the air. So we know that there's these external factors. Specifically, though, in aeromedical services, so looking at helicopter aeromedical services, helicopter EMS, they've identified this years ago, and the FAA now recommends that helicopter pilots, the pilot in charge of deciding whether or not it's safe to fly or not, be withheld from the information of the actual dispatch, because they could tell that there might be external pressures of a pilot to fly in marginal weather where they may otherwise not want to fly if they would hear that the patient was a child. Maybe it was a car crash and the pilot hears that it's a 9-year-old, and they now have this sudden urge or sudden pressure to fly into a thunderstorm, which could lead to a crash. So what they do is they withhold that information. They'll just tell them the direction of flight, their location, and then no patient details are provided to that crew until after they get off the ground. And I thought that was pretty interesting, and that could be something that might have some carryover into our dispatch procedures. Of course, we want to know as much information as possible when we're rolling out the door, right? We want to know, is there people inside of a fire? How many calls have you gotten, or did this come from an automatic fire alarm? We want to gather all this information. But really, fundamentally, what matters is the location and the type of apparatus and number of people that you have there. So I think that it could be worked out to have a dispatch procedure maybe that just says engine 1 respond to 123 Main Street, and then give them the rest of the information once they're already safely en route. So assuming that we treat everything as a fire and assume that there is fire until proven otherwise in the fire service, I think that there could be some sort of hybrid dispatch procedure there.
That's an interesting connection between aviation and the findings of your research. As you know, being a pilot, there are some very very robust training safety procedures for aviation that have been developed over the course of time. And of course, the fact that aviation has FAA oversight that can make national level rules gives them an advantage over the fire service, because we have no federal oversight that says that fire service has to do anything.
Right.
NFPA standards are recommendation standards. About the only one who would have any forceful guidance over us would be OSHA, and then they're only looking for really specific incidents of OSHA violations. And if you can do something egregious, but if it isn't covered by an OSHA regulation, then there's really not something to create some form of accountability. And I think that's really a big difference between aviation and the fire service. And when I have this conversation with people, I think they think that I am a person who believes in more government oversight versus less government oversight. But I'm actually a person who believes that less government oversight is better, but some government oversight, especially in the fire service, about how we do some things, the oversight should be more toward creating nationally accepted best practices that, like you say in aviation, FAA recommends that the pilot be withheld the information of the nature of the call so that they can make their fly or no fly decision based on factors of, weather and other safety factors, but not related to the type of call they're going to. The fire service really, I don't want to say is backwards, but we've got a lot of opportunity there to standardize some of the things that we do, even like, the nature of the types of calls that we go to with lights and sirens versus not, varies widely. I once with my own eyes observed a fire department who had a ladder company dispatched to change the key out on a Knox box and responded lights and sirens to that incident for reasons that I just looked with stunned amazement, because of the risk that you're, how do you justify, being in an accident if you were just,
a lawyer would eat them alive.
And now as this relates to your study, I don't think anybody's heart rate's running up because they got to change the key out in a lockbox. But
until they turn the siren.
it's the motoring public who I would worry about because that, as you say, sirens and lights create stress, and sometimes those civilians under stress do some pretty unpredictable things, which then can contribute to us being involved in an accident. And why we would bring that kind of risk on, the fire department that responds to a key box change out and uses lights and sirens would be the equivalent of a pilot making a decision. Well, yes, there's tornado warnings, but we're going to fly anyhow. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. Is there anything else you'd want to share with the audience, but you haven't had the chance to because I didn't ask you the right question?
No, I don't think so. I think that I was able to pull all my important stuff out, and hopefully, this can lead to some future research, and mainly just, in the words of Gordon Graham, slow down.
Yeah. Now, if somebody wanted to reach you, how could they find you?
I'll just throw my private email out there. It'd be the best thing. Dusty, Dusty, Lambert, Lambert @gmail.com. And be happy to discuss whatever they want to talk about. Okay.
And then is your dissertation published anywhere that it's available if they wanted to read it?
So it will be. It's currently being, I forget what the word is, but the library is holding it. It's not public yet because I'm working on publication with a couple journals right now. So the library is nice enough to not make it public until the journals get their first cut at it. So if as soon as that information gets out, then I'll pass that on to you. Maybe you can put it in the show notes. So
okay. All right. Well, thanks for being with me today. I can't believe we went through an hour that quickly, but it's so fascinating to hear about this research and your findings. And I hope that it will, at a minimum, start a conversation among fire departments, especially when they see some of this data. And I was busy, as my head was down, I was busy taking notes on these index cards of some of the statistics that you were sharing that are just really absolutely fascinating. And I think that would be unexpected findings for a lot of people. Even people who do this every day would be really surprised to see some of the things that you were able to reveal. So thank you for the hard work that you put into this, the time you put into this, the money you put into this, to whatever family you have on the back end that is your support. I know that is really, really key as well, as just having that support network, because for that time that it takes you to do it, you're seemingly always nose down in book work,
Yep.
or doing some form of classwork or research, and it just kind of creates a blur in your life for that period of time, and you really have to have that passion to see it through. So credit to you for having that passion to see it through, because I see a lot of people out there with that ABD after their name. And for anybody who has seen that doesn't know what that means, it means I'm Dr. So-and-so, ABD, all but dissertation. Well, if you're ABD, you're not Dr. So-and-so. You're student so-and-so, and you're not Dr. So-and-so until your dissertation is completed. So congratulations to you on getting over the hurdle and not being ABD, but actually full on Dr. Lambert. I'm so proud of you.
Well, thank you, Rich. I really appreciate that. You're right. It's been a lot of work, and I'm glad to get to this point. So that's why I'm all smiles.
All
Much
right.
appreciated.
Thanks for being here. All right. Bye-bye.
See you.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert, for sharing your research with us today. Since the start of the pandemic, I've had some tremendous opportunities to present my programs on virtual platforms to groups ranging in size from 6 to 400, with recorded playbacks being viewed over 29,000 times. Here's hoping that booster shots will help us to continue our quest toward some form of normalcy, whatever that will mean at whatever point in time. Thank you to the organizations that have hosted virtual and live events and since the start of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, I would list the upcoming events that I would have so you'd know where to find us in case you wanted to join us for a program, but after the pandemic hit, there wasn't much of a list to share over the past couple of years. But that's starting to make the turn and changing now. So I wanted to share with you where I'm going to be upcoming, and other master instructors going to be upcoming. March 1, I'll be at the Wright County Fire Chiefs Association Training Symposium in Minnesota. March 7th and 8th, I'll be presenting at the Maryland Fire Rescue Institute's National Fire Service Staff and Command Program. This is my 22nd consecutive year presenting for that program. March 12 to 17, Certified Master Instructor Bart Van Leven will be at the IFOC conference in Saudi Arabia. March 19 and 20, I'll be at the Delran Fire Department in Delran, New Jersey. March 26th, I'll be at the Nebraska Fire Chiefs Association Conference. March 27th, I'll be with the Buffalo County Mutual Aid Association, also in Nebraska. April 9th, I'll be at the Maryland Fire Chiefs Association Conference in Rockville, Maryland. April 26th and 27th at the Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware Association of Electric Cooperatives in Palmyra, Virginia. April 28th at the Voluntary Protection Program Participants Association Conference in Las Vegas, Nevada. May 5th, a program for the management team of the National Park Service at Yellowstone Park in Montana. And the master instructors and I are all working hard to add programs to the list as well. So if you want to view the list, you can just go over the samatters.com website and everything is listed there. If you're interested in hosting a live event or a virtual event, just click on the Contact Us tab at the top of the SA Matters the top of the SA Matters website, and I'll give you a call. Finally, remember to check our show notes for how to subscribe to our newsletter and how to follow us on social media. There we share ideas about how to make better decisions under stress and how to improve the skills of critical thinking and resilient problem solving. Well, that's it. Episode 388 of the Situational Awareness Matters show is complete. Thank you again to my guest, Dr. Dusty Lambert, for sharing your research with us today. And thank you, the listeners and viewers of our show, for sharing some of your valuable time with me today. I really appreciate your support of the SA Matters mission. Be safe out there, and may the peace of the Lord and strong situational awareness be with you always.
You've been listening to the Situational Awareness Matters show with Dr. Richard Gasaway. If you're interested in learning more about situational awareness, human factors, and decision making under stress, visit his website, samatters.com. If you're interested in booking Dr. Gasaway for a program, or if you would like to be a guest on his show, click the Contact Us tab at the top of the homepage.